How was this supposed to be administered? Do we have any feeling for how this was supposed to be carried out? Well, I would suggest to you that the 5th, 8th, and 10th commandments, which enjoin honoring father and mother, which prohibit stealing, which prohibit coveting, indicate to us that the dominion mandate was to be carried out in humankind through individual and familial administration. You really can't say, thou shalt not steal, unless you presuppose that there is such a thing as private property. How did poverty relief work in ancient Israel? I mean, that might be a good thing to look at, the theocracy. Okay, God himself wrote these laws. They should have been pretty good. Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 7 through 8 and 10 through 11. If there be among you a poor man of one of thy brethren within any of thy gates in thy land, which the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt not harden thine heart, nor shut thy hand from thy poor brother. But thou shalt open thy hand wide unto him, and shalt surely lend him sufficient for his need in that which he wanteth. Beware that there be not a thought in thy wicked heart, and thine eyes be evil against thy poor brother, and thou givest him not, and he cry unto the Lord against thee, and it be sin unto thee. And you can read further in that passage. It's noteworthy that there is no civil penalty or government apparatus of coercion set up in this case to ensure that this giving to the poor was in fact carried out. It seems as though the Lord reserved it to himself to deal with that type of a shortcoming. Furthermore, enjoying the fruit of one's own labors, well, that's actually a blessing from God. Psalm 128, verses 1 and 2, Ecclesiastes 3:13, and also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God. Well, I would suggest to you that charity, it is an obligation, but it is not the type of obligation that can be satisfied by coercion. In order for charity to be charity, to encourage love, to encourage success, to encourage the uplifting of the poor, it must be voluntary. It must be given voluntarily. Well, that was, we're saying that that is a trap door to liberalism. That if we're not very careful, we can overstep the bounds of moral relativism, break God's laws for society, and self-righteously think that we're doing good when really we're simply furthering a liberal agenda. And of course, you know that liberalism must be bad, right? Anything with the label liberalism. Anyway. Well, you know, there's one more thing though that we have to look at. And that, you know, is this nagging question of why do some people have more than others anyway? The unfairness doctrine and the marketing of liberalism. The unfairness doctrine says, I always wanted blue hair, but I've got green hair. That's unfair. Timmy lives in a 2-story house, and he has a swimming pool. I just got this old plastic thing in my front yard. That's unfair. Timmy isn't any better than I am. That's unfair. Oh, it's unfair. Unfair. The unfairness doctrine poisons the possibility of thankfulness. It breeds instead a bitter, resentful, you owe it to me attitude, which short-circuits an appreciation for God's grace. It also helps begin the process of spiritual degeneration detailed in Romans chapter 1. For when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful. The unfairness doctrine undercuts the validity, value, and richness of all human experience and circumstances. You can be a happy person and lead a tremendously valid and fulfilling life even though you don't have a 2-story house and a swimming pool in the ground, okay? And there are millions of people who have done that or are doing that this very day. You see, the liberal relegates the person who they would judge as being unfairly endowed or treated. They relegate that person de facto to an unfulfilled, miserable life. Terribly, terribly false notion. No, the unfairness doctrine poisons a long-term, persevering outlook, replacing it with a shift the blame, I can't do it attitude. But you know, the unfairness doctrine is what the moral liberal, the liberal who goes in by the back door and says, I want to be a liberal because liberalism is a way to do good. By preaching the unfairness doctrine is how that backdoor liberal markets liberalism. Okay, I guess that's really the trapdoor liberal, I should have said. Okay, who believes that liberalism is a morally positive system. He markets liberal by preaching to the masses, saying it's unfair. It's unfair that you haven't got this or that or the other, and that X, Y, Z over here has it. Jesus was once asked to divide an inheritance, which perhaps, and we perhaps can assume it was, distributed unfairly. Master, speak to my brother that he divide the inheritance with me. Jesus answered, Man, who made me a ruler or a divider over you? Take heed and beware of covetousness. For a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. Well, I indicated earlier, I used the adjective horrifying. A horrifying destiny awaits us if we go the liberal path. I'd like to give you an example. You know, liberalism is a very old doctrine. Here's an example from about 2500 BC. In the estate of the goddess Ba'u in Lagash, that's Mesopotamia, during the 3rd millennium BC. Detailed accounts and records have been preserved in the form of a huge number of cuneiform tablets. The bulk of the land was tilled by parties of workers under the supervision of the temple. These workers were looked upon as part of the estate and were called people of the estate of the Ba'u goddess. In the temple's records, numerous lists of the workers have been preserved. Here we meet such groups as porters and men who do not raise their eyes, interpreted as unskilled laborers, slave women and children. All received approximately the same allowance. No unfairness here. Men did not receive subsistence for their families, but appeared only as individuals. Women and children are mentioned separately. Orphans formed a special category. The workers seem to have had no private holdings. The temple storehouse provided them with all the necessities. Evidently, workers, usually every month, came to the storehouse in parties to get their rations, which consisted primarily of grain. Workers did not till separate plots individually, but worked in parties under the supervision of a chief farmer. All implements of production, including draft animals, were issued to the foreman of the working parties from the storehouses on a daily basis. Plows, hoes, flails, packs, collars, and yokes for oxen were all kept in the stores. The central store provided fodder for the oxen and donkeys. Fishermen also worked in parties and had norms to fill and the obligation of delivering their entire catch to the storehouse. We must all do our part, cooperate for the good of everyone. Artisans worked in the same fashion. Animal skins, metal, and wool were received from the stores. Manufactured articles were in turn delivered there. They too received food supplies from the estate. All workers employed by the temple of the goddess Ba'u were guaranteed clothing or material for clothing. Slaves are seldom treated as a separate group, and when they are, women are generally meant. Do you think that the liberal emancipation of the woman has helped women's socioeconomic status in our country today? Look closely. I think you'll see that it has not. Other features of life in the region of Lagash during the latter period of the third dynasty of Ur are also worth noting. Like crafts, trade was a monopoly of the state. In both state and temple records, slaves are mentioned, but women slaves appear much more frequently. At first, these were mostly weavers, but later they came to be employed in other work as well. Evidently, the children of slave women were absorbed into the general mass of unskilled labor. The percentage of the land seized for the king's household, including the temple household, was enormous. In the third dynasty of Ur, we must take 60% as a minimum, says one scholar. A series of extant documents testify to the fact that private property played a certain role in economic life. For example, certain bills of sale for children sold into slavery. But in the main sphere of economic life, the significance of private property could not have been great. During the third dynasty of Ur, material inequality reached extraordinary proportions. And now we see the cruel irony of the unfairness doctrine. Everyone is equal except for those who administer the system which distributes goods equally. Now, obviously, since they are so much more important, knowledgeable, and crucial to this whole system, they, and there is no one above them, you see, to give account to, they get what they want. And justify it, no doubt, with the moral relativism that spawned liberalism in the first place. The difficult existence led by the lower segments of the population is reflected in the great number of records dealing with escapes. Another index of the conditions is the striking mortality figures preserved in the archives. In connection with the apportioning of grain, it is recorded that in one party 10% of all workers died in 1 year's time, in another party 14%, in a third 28%. In one list, the death of more than 100 women out of 150 is reported. Still higher was the mortality rate for children who, together with women, were employed in heavy work such as barge hauling. In general, the notation deceased is encountered with extraordinary frequency. Liberalism in its ultimate embodiment. It's been tried many times throughout history, and the results are inevitably and invariably the same grim picture that you see here from almost 4,000 years ago. Well, the fundamental mistake I would suggest to you in the Pharisees, the masses, and the morally misguided liberals is the mistake of attempting to free themselves from relationships which God has established for people to function within. The relationship of man to God, the relationship with man to man. You know, David was very wise when he said, when he and his nation were in trouble, "Let me fall into the hands of God, for his mercies are great. Let me not fall into the hands of man." It may be that there are among us today those who are feeling keenly the pain, the dislocation that results from attempting to deny, circumvent our proper relationships with God, with our fellow man. And I would like to invite any of you today, whether it be that you're fighting your relationship with Christ as a Savior from sin, whether you have refused or neglected to ask God forgiveness, whether there are other relationships in your life which you have not submitted to the hand of God, you're invited this morning to do that as we sing our invitation hymn.